Republican Senator Eric Schmitt of Missouri, member of the Judiciary and Armed Services Committee, joins us. And remember, he also served as Missouri's Attorney General. Senator, welcome. Good to see you today.
Good to be with you, Shannon.
Okay, so there are so many different things to unpack with all of these various legal challenges. It seems to me the Trump administration very much knew that they would flood the system with things that would automatically be challenged in court. Are they trying to get to answers to force, maybe even the 9 justices to weigh in on some of these really difficult questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these big cases are all headed to the Supreme Court eventually. And, I think there's a lot of noise with these district court rulings that make their way through the appellate courts. But particularly on the case that you're highlighting, the deportations of the violent gang members from Venezuela, the president has the apex of his authority is longstanding law, the Youngstown Steel case from 1952, when there's a congressional delegation of that authority, like immigration laws, and core Article 2 powers, the commander-in-chief power. So by the president invoking the Alien Enemies Act, he has that power. In fact, the district court has no jurisdiction to direct that kind of decision-making as they do troop movements or missile strikes. So ultimately, that's the issue that's going to make its way to the Supreme Court, whether they hear this temporary restraining order or it goes back for a more of a preliminary injunction, a ruling on the merits, and then to the Supreme Court in a few months. But ultimately, that's where these are headed. And I would also point out, Shannon, too, he's on very solid ground with these domestic cases as well, because he's not, unlike Joe Biden, he's not trying to expand the authority of the presidency to student loan debt forgiveness. We brought that case when I was AG and won. What he's really trying to do is he's trying to manage personnel and costs within the executive branch, and he clearly has the authority to do that.
Okay, so before we leave the deportation case on the Alien Enemies Act, one of the big arguments from those defending these folks who were deported is that there was no way for them to challenge, no due process measure for them to say, hey, I'm caught up in this, I'm not a gang member, here's my proof of that. So what about that part of the argument, allowing these people to make their case before they're put on a plane?
Well, those are arguments that are generally well received when you're an American citizen. When you're here illegally and you're committing crimes and you're a criminal that have been torturing people in Colorado, cutting their fingers off and murdering and raping Americans, that doesn't hold the same amount of water. So, of course, that's going to be their argument. But criminal aliens are not afforded that same level of due process as American citizens, obviously. And so I think the president will ultimately win here because under that congressionally enacted statute, the Alien Enemies Act, the court just doesn't have jurisdiction, and the president is acting within his core commander-in-chief authority. And just the separation of powers works both ways. Just like the president can't command the court to take up a certain case or rule a certain way, there are just some instances where the court, like foreign policy matters, just doesn't have jurisdiction.
Okay, so a number of these cases, there are all kinds of different temporary holds, bans, temporary restraining orders. Let's talk about another one of these cases, and this has to deal with the administration's efforts, they say, to block people who are struggling, they say, with gender dysphoria from being in the military. So here's a little bit of what we have at foxnews.com. The Trump administration is now appealing after a federal judge blocked its ban on transgender people in the military that was set to go into effect on Friday, which means, in theory, the D.C. Court of Appeals has only one day to make a ruling. How quickly do you think we find out more on this?
I mean, I think this is going to be sort of the what we've seen. This is going to play itself out in the courts. But I think, again, the Trump administration's on solid footing here. Just like when the previous president put these policies in place, the current president, President Trump, can retract those as commander-in-chief of our military. So I think he ultimately wins on this, too. But again, there's going to be some back and forth at the district court level, appellate court level, ultimately Supreme Court level. But at the end of the day, when the Supreme Court weighs in, I think President Trump's right on almost all of these issues here.
So there are the issues on the merits that they'll get to. There's also this issue of these nationwide injunctions, and we're hearing talk that there are measures now in the House and potentially Senate side that would limit the ability of a single federal district judge. There are hundreds of them to shut down a program nationwide, not just for the district they oversee. What can you tell us about Capitol Hill efforts on that point?
Yeah, I think on the Judiciary Committee, Chairman Grassley signaled that we're going to have a hearing on that potentially as early as next week on some legislation that he's sponsoring, because you've just seen really broad abuse of this, right? This is a relatively new phenomenon where a single district court judge, and there are hundreds of them across the country, dictating policy across the country at the scale that we're seeing right now is just not manageable. So I think there is a lot of momentum to deal with that, and that's certainly within the Article 1, Congress's purview to do that.
All right, Senator, we will watch that and all of these other cases. They tracked through the system. Senator Eric Schmitt, thank you.
Thanks, Shannon.